My sister humiliated me at her party. But what she did afterward shook me to my core. My name is Lena Miller. The first thing you should know is that I didn't flinch. Not at first. Ava's voice rang through the ballroom like a champagne glass cracking against marble. Let's all toast to the family's overachiever and to the one who always lagged behind. She laughed, an effortless, polished kind of laugh, like she was delivering a punchline to a joke we'd all supposedly agreed to long ago. And just like that, the air changed. I could feel the heat crawl up my neck before I even saw the faces turn toward me. Half amused, half pitying. The kind of gaze people wear when they're grateful not to be the target. I was standing near the window, nursing a half-finished flute of Brut, trying to blend into the floral arrangements and uplighting. But no corner of that glittering hotel ballroom was dim enough to disappear into. Her words had landed. Everyone heard it. Everyone saw me. Ava was beaming, a little too pleased with herself. Hair blown out to perfection, eyes glittering with the kind of ambition that never slept. She looked like the star of her own gala, even though technically it was just a corporate celebration hosted by her firm. A quarterly ritual meant to recognize high performers and reinforce the illusion that we were all one big, high-functioning family. Ava loved these nights, the lights, the power, the subtle politics of who stood where. And who didn't? Me? I was just a guest. The tag-along sibling who somehow ended up invited, not by merit, not by design, just by proximity. I heard the chuckles ripple through the crowd. Muted. Nervous. Safe. My fingers curled around the stem of my glass. I kept my spine straight. Breathed in through my nose, slow and measured. I told myself I wouldn't react. Not in front of these people, especially not in front of her. She hadn't looked at me directly after the joke. Ava was clever that way. Delivered it with just enough distance that it could be passed off as harmless. A family quip. Sisterly fun. But we both knew better. I had felt that line coming long before she said it. Like a slow-moving train I'd been watching since childhood. To the one who always lagged behind. Can you imagine your own sister framing your entire existence like a footnote in her highlight reel? Not out of malice, necessarily. Just convenience. Ava liked a tidy narrative. She'd always cast herself as the trailblazer, the firework. I was the shadow trailing quietly behind. The one who made things easier by being small, still, invisible, until moments like this. When she needed contrast. I looked at her glass, still raised high, her fingers perfectly manicured. A hush had followed her toast, just long enough for people to question if it was okay to laugh. Long enough for a few eyes to meet mine and quickly dart away again. The moment should have passed, but it didn't, because I didn't say anything. I just stood there, silent, calm, my face an unreadable mask. And in that silence, something deeper than humiliation unfolded. A sting settled over the room. That's when I realized silence wasn't surrender. It was a mirror. The discomfort didn't come from my embarrassment. It came from theirs. From the quiet weight of years they never thought to ask about. The way I let Ava shine because I thought it was safer than trying to stand next to her. I felt it in my bones. This was the moment Ava had finally overplayed her hand. Not because she said something cruel, but because, for the first time, everyone noticed. She'd expected a laugh. She got a reckoning. And before anyone could shift the attention, Mr. Grant Taylor, her boss, turned toward me from across the table. He blinked once. Miller? Lena Miller? I nodded, the same quiet way I always have. He didn't say anything more, just watched me. Long enough for Ava to notice. And I knew right then, something had changed. I didn't leave the room. I didn't excuse myself or search for a glass of water or pretend I needed to take a call. I just stood there, still as breath, with every nerve in my body vibrating like piano wire. And yet, I didn't break. That seemed to disturb people more than if I had. My cheeks were flushed, yes, but not from shame. It was something else. That particular heat that comes when the body senses a crack in the old order. A shift. Maybe even freedom. The laughter had died off almost instantly. Ava's joke floated in the air like the scent of something spoiled. Everyone had gone back to their drinks, their plates, their tiny hors d'oeuvre. But I could feel it, the low buzz of discomfort moving through the room like electricity. People weren't sure what they were reacting to. The joke? My silence? Or the realization that Ava might have said something deeply unkind without even meaning to, and that made it worse somehow. Ava herself was talking too loudly now. I heard her voice pitching upward, bouncing around trivial topics, her new Pilates instructor, the board meeting last week, something about her trip to Sonoma. She always filled silence with stories that didn't need telling. But I could feel her watching me. She kept flicking her gaze over, like she expected me to. What? Cry? Leave? Prove her right? Instead, I sipped my champagne, steady and silent, and looked out the tall hotel windows at the city glowing back at me. I watched as reflections of strangers drifted across the glass. My own face, calm and unreadable, stared back. And there it was again, that prickling sensation down my spine. Someone else watching me. Not Ava, not one of her colleagues, not the pitying older woman at table 6 who kept glancing at me like I might crumble. It was him, Grant Taylor, her boss. He was still watching me. Not with judgment, not with pity, with interest. As if I were a question he'd never thought to ask. As if something in me didn't match the story Ava had just told. Miller? Lena Miller? He'd said before. Like he was turning over a name he'd only ever seen on paper. And suddenly realized there was a living, breathing person attached to it. I met his gaze then. Just for a second. I didn't smile. I didn't nod again. I simply held the look, then turned back toward the window. Let them wonder. Let them sit in it. The truth was, I had spent most of my life mastering the art of invisibility. I wore it like armor. Quiet, dependable Lena. Background Lena. The sister who never competed. The one who stayed late, picked up the slack, remembered birthdays, and never needed attention. I wasn't fragile. I was practiced. But in that moment, standing alone, lit by city lights and champagne chandeliers, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself until now. I didn't want to be invisible anymore, not out of vanity, not to prove anything to Ava. Just because I deserved to exist, I heard someone whisper my name. Not loudly, just a soft exchange between two people near the dessert table. Lena Miller? Isn't she the one who… And then it faded. But not before I saw the ripple. That name, my name, was starting to mean something. No one came up to me. No one offered a napkin or a kind word, and I didn't need them to. The buzz of discomfort they all felt, that was theirs to carry. Mine was something else entirely. Peace, tense and tentative, but mine. Because when silence holds power, people start leaning in. I didn't notice when Grant Taylor stepped up to the microphone. Maybe I wasn't meant to. Not at first. The chatter dulled slowly, like the tide pulling back, revealing the shape of something unexpected beneath the surface. Before we close tonight, he said, his voice smooth and measured, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a recent win. One that didn't come from a title, but from tenacity, from clarity, from someone who doesn't always take center stage, but maybe should. That's when I looked up. He wasn't smiling the way most people smile in moments like this. It wasn't performative. It wasn't some smug managerial nod meant to pacify or placate. No, his expression was quiet, thoughtful, sharp. He paused, just long enough for everyone to shift forward in their seats, drinks halfway to their lips. Some of you know that the Boston division was on the verge of losing the Greystone account last quarter, he continued. Millions in renewals, long-term contracts, slipping through our fingers after months of strained negotiations. There were murmurs now, heads turning. A few glances thrown toward Ava, who had been leading that project. Or so they'd thought. Grant cleared his throat and smiled, just slightly. What many of you don't know is that the person who rebuilt our pitch deck, restructured the analytics, and personally caught the discrepancy in Greystone's retention clause wasn't even officially on the team. Something inside me stilled. Then he said my name. Lena Miller. Please stand, if you would. The silence that followed wasn't uncertain this time. It was reverent. My chair suddenly felt a mile deep. My breath caught in that place between disbelief and clarity. The room was still. Every face turned toward me. And I stood. Slowly. No smile, no gesture. Just presence. Grant nodded toward me, then raised his glass. Without her, this deal wouldn't have happened. Without her, the Boston division would be having a very different kind of quarter. Let's raise a glass to the kind of brilliance that doesn't always shout to be seen, but shows up when it matters most. It was Ava's division, but it was my work. The applause started softly, then spread like kindling catching flame. A wave. Not thunderous, but full. People rose from their chairs. A toast. For me. And across the ballroom, Ava stood frozen. Her expression unreadable. She didn't clap right away. She didn't move. She just stared. Lips parted slightly, brow creased in that way she gets when the world refuses to spin the way she expects. Grant said nothing more. He didn't need to. He let the moment linger like a promise that sometimes the ones who go unseen are the very ones holding everything together. I sat back down slowly. My hands didn't tremble. My eyes didn't sting. Instead, I felt something deeper than vindication. I felt seen. And it wasn't Ava's version of me they applauded. It was mine. The applause had faded. The plates were cleared. Conversations began to swell again, but quieter now, like people weren't sure if the room was still holding its breath. I sat in that moment, letting it stretch inside me. Not to gloat, not to bask, just to finally feel what it was like, to take up space without apology. I should have known Ava wouldn't let it end there. I saw her reflection first, angled in the gilded mirror that hung above the marble sinks in the ladies' room. Her lipstick was perfect, her eyes rimmed with that smoky shadow she'd perfected in college. She didn't knock, didn't hesitate. Just closed the door behind her with a soft click and leaned against it. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "did you plan this?" I turned toward her slowly. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even angry, exactly. She was something worse. Unsettled. "I didn't plan anything," I said evenly. "I came because you invited me." "That's not what I meant." Her eyes narrowed. "You knew he'd bring it up, that deal. You knew he'd say something." "All I did," I replied, voice quiet but steady, "was show up." And that was the truth. I hadn't tipped anyone off. I hadn't whispered to Grant or dropped hints about the work I'd done behind the scenes. When Ava's team had hit a wall, and someone forwarded me the raw data in a panic, I'd jumped in out of habit, not for recognition, not for strategy. Just because I knew how to fix it, and I didn't like seeing the work crumble. Ava stared at me like she didn't recognize the person standing in front of her, like I had shapeshifted into someone she couldn't categorize. "I didn't ask for credit," I said gently, "but I'm not sorry someone finally gave it." She looked away then, her eyes darting toward the window, where the city blinked back at us, too alive, too unforgiving. "You know," she whispered, almost to herself, "they always said you were the smart one. Mom, Dad, even in high school, teachers would call the house and tell them how brilliant you were, but they'd still come to my dance recitals, my debate competitions, my college visits." My breath caught. "I never said anything," she went on, her voice suddenly unsteady. "Because deep down, I kept thinking, if I could just stay ahead of you, loud enough, bright enough, they wouldn't see how far behind I actually felt." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because some truths deserve their own silence. They need room to echo. "I never wanted to outshine you," I said finally. "I just wanted to exist without being mocked." The words hung between us like vapor, and I saw it, just a flicker, in her eyes. The weight of all the years between us, of what was said and what was never spoken. She didn't apologize. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But when she turned and opened the bathroom door, she hesitated in the threshold. Then, without turning back, she said softly, "You didn't have to do anything for people to see you tonight. That's what scares me the most." And then she was gone. That night, I didn't take a car. I slipped out the hotel's side entrance, the hush of the hallway giving way to the cool, flickering quiet of the city at night. Boston pulsed around me, dim street lamps, late-night taxis, a couple laughing somewhere behind me. The chill bit softly at my cheeks, and I welcomed it. I walked without a destination, just letting my heels echo down sidewalks I'd memorized through years of passing unseen. I didn't need to be home yet. I needed this space, air, the absence of performance. There was no music swelling, no cinematic ending, just the sound of my own breath, even and steady. I passed by a storefront window and caught my reflection, hair pinned loosely from the evening, the sleeves of my coat falling open, face flushed. There was nothing spectacular about me, and yet I looked different. Lighter. Not because something magical had happened, but because nothing had. No revenge, no scripted takedown, just truth. Finally named. And seen. I thought about the applause earlier. How it had come, not from a stage I'd fought to climb, but from a room that had finally turned its gaze. And I thought of Ava. Her voice in that restroom still echoed in pieces. Not the accusation, but the part she hadn't meant to reveal, the part she'd hidden behind 10 years of quips and subtle digs. That deep-down, quiet fear of not being enough. Funny, isn't it? How we spend so long shrinking around people who are secretly terrified we might grow bigger than them without even trying. I walked until the buildings thinned out and the traffic faded, just a handful of glowing windows above me. My shoes clicked softer on the stone. My shoulders loosened. I passed a florist's still lit from the back. A row of white tulips sat in a silver bucket just inside the glass. I stopped, watched them sway slightly under the overhead vent. Clean. Quiet. Unapologetic. I didn't buy them. I didn't need to carry anything more. A few blocks later, I turned onto my street. Home waited, just the way I left it. Lamps dimmed, dishes in the sink. The kind of space that never asked me to be anything but still. I slipped off my coat, set down my bag, and stood by the window. No stream of texts, no buzz of missed calls. Just the thrum of my own pulse in my ears, and the distant hum of a train far across the city. It was peaceful, not because everything was fixed, but because for once I hadn't bent. And there, in the hush of it all, a small smile lifted the corner of my mouth. Not smug, not triumphant, just real. 2 days later, she came. I saw her before she spoke, standing just inside the glass doors of the lobby, out of place among the muted blues and calm quiet of our office building. Ava, in her fitted ivory coat, her heels too high for the tile, hands clutched awkwardly around a leather handbag she wasn't sure she wanted to be carrying anymore. She looked unsure. Not like the woman who toasted over champagne or swept into boardrooms with a practiced stride. This Ava was still. Heavy. Like whatever shield she'd carried all these years had been set down, and she wasn't quite sure how to stand without it. I don't know how long she lingered in reception before the front desk buzzed me. "There's someone asking for you," said Dana, our receptionist. Her voice dropped an octave, quieter. "She says she's your sister." I didn't answer right away. Just pressed my palm flat against the desk and felt the coolness of the surface beneath my skin. "I'll be right down," I said. The elevator felt slower than usual. Every floor blinked with an old kind of tension, muscle memory from a childhood spent waiting to be acknowledged, or left behind. When the doors opened, she turned quickly. Our eyes met, no dramatic entrance, no scene. Just a moment. Two women who used to share a last name before life started separating us by everything else. "Hi," she said. I nodded. "Hi." Neither of us moved closer. And strangely, that space between us felt more honest than any hug we could have forced. "I didn't want to call," she began, voice low. I didn't know if you'd even pick up." "That would have depended on the day," I said, not cruelly, just truthfully. She gave a half laugh. Or maybe it was a breath too sharp to be either. "I deserve that." I looked past her for a moment, out the wide glass windows. The street beyond was quiet, sunlight spilling between buildings in sharp golden slants. Everything looked ordinary, perfectly unremarkable, which made the weight of her being here even more strange. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said, softer now. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about wanting to exist without being mocked." Her voice caught. "All these years, I thought you were fine. I thought you didn't care. You always let me be the loud one, the one people noticed. I assumed it didn't bother you, that you liked it that way." I didn't respond. There are some wounds that don't heal just because someone finally names them. "I realized," she continued, brushing a hand across her temple like the words were heavy, "that maybe the reason I kept needing the attention was because deep down, I thought if I stopped performing, I wouldn't matter. And the thought that you could matter without performing at all, it terrified me." My throat tightened. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she added quickly. "I just needed to say it. Needed you to know that I see it now. You were never the failure." I let the words settle, not rushing to fix them or soften their edges. Then I said, "I never needed to outshine you, Ava. I just needed to be allowed in the room without someone turning out the light." She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. For once, she didn't have a clever comeback. She just nodded, small, slow, like it was all finally making sense. And that's how we stood. Two sisters in a lobby. No grand reconciliation. No hug to tie it up neatly. Just the quiet beginning of a truth spoken out loud. Sometimes, that's all the healing a moment can hold. That evening, I walked home again. No celebration this time. No echo of applause trailing behind me. Just the soft rhythm of my boots on pavement and the city humming quietly in its own skin. The streetlights blinked on in pairs as I passed, and for once, the silence wasn't about hiding. It felt earned. Like I had finally stepped out of a room I'd been locked in for years, only to realize I had the key the whole time. I paused at the crosswalk near the river, just where the Charles opened up wide, and stood there longer than I needed to. Watching headlights stretch like ribbons across the water, I thought of how many times I'd walked this same route after family events, dinners, holidays. Back then, I used to replay every conversation in my head, every glance Ava gave me, every sentence that made me feel smaller than I already was. But not tonight. Tonight, there was nothing to untangle, no story to rewrite in my head so I could sleep. I simply existed. And that, somehow, was enough. At home, I made tea. Let the quiet fill the apartment like warm light. I didn't check my messages. Didn't turn on the TV. I just let the stillness settle around me. I think that's what peace really is. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of needing to explain yourself in it. The next morning, my inbox was full. Subject lines like, "Saw what Grant said," "Wow," and "Can we set up a quick chat? Greystone?" One email was from the CFO, another from someone in legal. Suddenly, my name, Lena Miller, wasn't just something to say in passing. It was attached to something solid, something real. But none of that was the moment that stuck. That came later, because 2 days after the gala, just as I was returning from lunch, I saw her again. Ava, standing in the reception area of my office building like she wasn't entirely sure she belonged there. She looked different. No coat this time, just a soft sweater and slacks. Hair pulled back. No armor. Her hands were empty. I stopped just inside the glass doors. She noticed me but didn't move. It was like she was waiting for a signal that it was okay to speak, and after a long beat I gave it a small nod. Barely perceptible, but enough. She stepped closer. "I don't know why I'm here," she said, laughing nervously. "I thought I did, but now I'm standing here, and everything I rehearsed sounds wrong." I didn't say anything. Just waited. I was awful to you for a long time, she said, and I've spent the last 2 days realizing that maybe I needed you to stay small so I could feel big. And now that I've seen what it looks like when you don't, when you let yourself take up space, I feel like I'm finally seeing who you actually are. Her voice trembled. Her hands twisted at the hem of her sleeve. You were never the failure, Lena. She paused, swallowed. I was afraid that you'd outshine me and not even notice. I blinked, but didn't look away. I'd imagined 100 versions of this moment, but none of them had her saying that. She waited for me to speak. I didn't rush. Then finally, I said, I didn't want to outshine you, Ava. I just didn't want to be stepped over every time I stood up. A pause. And for the first time in our adult lives, she didn't defend, didn't deflect. She just nodded. And that nod, that was something. Maybe not an apology wrapped in a bow, but a beginning. A crack in the wall we'd both lived behind for too long. She showed up again the next day. No grand entrance, no careful outfit. She arrived at my office just before lunch, her bag slung over one shoulder. A to-go coffee in her hand she never actually drank. The receptionist looked at me with eyebrows raised, silently asking if she should wave Ava through. I nodded. Quietly. And maybe a little curious. This time, Ava didn't hover by the doorway like she had before. She stepped in and sat in the chair across from my desk, her knees pressed tightly together, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Can I talk? She asked. I gestured for her to go on. I've been trying to figure out when it started, she said, her voice softer now. When I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as something I needed to outrun. That sentence sat between us like a confession no priest had asked for. I think it was when you got into Northwestern, she continued. I remember Mom trying to act happy, but she went real quiet, and Dad said something about how it didn't make sense to go all the way out there when there were good enough schools nearby. And I remember thinking, if they can downplay that, they can downplay anything. And if I just stayed loud enough, maybe they'd never have time to look back at you. She paused. But they were always looking, even when you were silent. I watched her, unsure if I was supposed to feel comfort in that. You didn't have to say anything to make them compare us, she said. And I hated you for that. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you didn't try. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Try? To compete, she said quickly. To explain yourself. To demand what was fair. You just let them erase you. And part of me envied how you could be so unaffected by it. I looked down at my hands then, resting on the desk like they had nothing left to carry. I wasn't unaffected, I said quietly. I just learned early that asking for space only made people resent the space I took. She sat with that. Then I envied the wrong thing, she whispered. Because that's not strength. That's survival. I nodded. Exactly. A long silence stretched between us. Then she leaned forward, both elbows on her knees, her voice barely above a breath. Lena, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every time I turned you into a punchline. For the times I saw you disappear and didn't try to pull you back. For the way I used you as a prop in my own story. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just said it. For once, without needing to be seen as brave for doing so. I looked at her and felt the tightness in my chest ease, not because everything was suddenly healed, but because someone finally named what had been real for so long. I never wanted to outshine you, I said again, softer now. I just wanted to exist without being mocked. I know, she said. And the truth is, I don't even know who I am outside of all that anymore. You get to find out, I told her, the same way I am. We didn't hug. It didn't feel like that kind of moment. But we sat there for a while longer, the silence between us no longer heavy. Just human. Eventually she stood, smoothed her skirt and said, I'm glad I came. So am I answered. She smiled. Not a perfect smile, a tired one, a real one. And then she left. Later that week, I came home to find a florist's delivery box waiting by my door. Inside was a bouquet of simple white freesias, my favorite, though I'd never told her that. Tucked into the stems was a small handwritten card. "Thank you for showing me what strength looks like. Ava." I stood there in the hallway for a long time, the flowers in one hand, the card in the other, unsure whether to cry or laugh or just breathe. I didn't call her. I didn't send a thank you text. I simply walked to the windowsill above my kitchen sink, moved aside the old candle I kept forgetting to throw away, and placed the vase right where the morning light would hit. Not because I was forgiving her, but because something deserved to grow there. Something gentle. Something that finally made room for me too. The flowers stayed on my windowsill for 2 weeks. They bloomed quietly, small white freesia blossoms opening each morning like they had something to say, but only to the light. I didn't touch them much, just refreshed the water every few days, watching as they softened, then slowly began to curl inward. By the time the petals started to fall, I knew I wasn't going to throw them away right away. I kept the glass vase, let the stems linger a little longer, not because I was holding on, but because I needed the reminder. That moment happened. Ava's card stayed tucked behind the vase, its ink slightly smudged from the condensation, the handwriting hers. Elegant, careful, but a little uneven, like even her apology had trembled its way out of her. She never asked for anything after that. No more drop-ins. No follow-up messages. Just silence. But this time, it wasn't the kind that erased me. It was space. A kind of stillness that finally felt like respect. A week later, I was organizing the top drawer of my desk, sorting through old receipts, rubber bands that had long since lost their stretch, a few forgotten pens that had run dry. And buried beneath a stack of half-used notepads, I found the old envelope, the one I hadn't been able to throw out. Inside, the program from Ava's college graduation, a ticket stub from a childhood play she starred in, a faded thank you card from our mother, scribbled with a hasty, "We're so proud of both of you," after I won an award for something no one attended. I sat with it all for a while. And then, one by one, I let them go. Not out of bitterness, not to erase the past, but because they weren't proof anymore. I didn't need evidence that I had once been overlooked. That part of me no longer asked to be seen that way. I had shown up. I had been seen. Not because someone finally handed me a microphone, but because I stopped whispering in rooms I had every right to speak in. The next morning, I took what was left of the flowers, the softened stems, the delicate paper, thin petals, and walked them out to the community garden near my building. I'd passed it 100 times without really noticing it. But that day, I stopped. There was a small compost bin tucked behind the trellis. I laid the bouquet inside gently. Not with ceremony. Just release. Not everything that blooms is meant to last. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. Walking back, I felt it. The difference. The absence of weight. Not because Ava and I had turned into best friends. Not because the past had been rewritten. But because, for once, I wasn't carrying it all alone anymore. Peace didn't arrive like a sunrise. It came like this. Quiet. Soft. Something I had to choose again and again. Every time I don't shrink. Every time I don't explain myself. Every time I stand still when someone tries to fold me back into the role I outgrew. That's peace. And it stays. Even when other things don't. If you've ever spent your life in the background, waiting for someone to notice you, maybe it's time to ask, what happens when you notice yourself first? That answer changes everything. If this story spoke to something in you, I'd love to hear it in the comments. You're not invisible here.